guess that if I were to ask how many were unmarried here, you would be in the majority. Let me just see your hands. I am right, aren't I? Good morning. I would like to draw your attention to the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll be considering chapter 7, verse 1 through to 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 through to 16. Let me read, and I'm reading from the New King James Version. Now, concerning the things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Likewise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Now, if you have cared to read through the book of 1 Corinthians, and possibly the second, it reveals the problems and the pressures and the struggles of a church that has been called out of a pagan society. And such churches are characterized by factions and lawsuits. He would seem to be suggesting immorality and so on. Because it was a relatively new church, they had questions, lots of questions about a whole host of issues. So part of what he does among other things, is to answer questions, the questions this church had. And those questions included questions on marriage, on divorce, questions on the unmarried, on widows, on meats offered to idols, decorum in public worship, spiritual gifts, the resurrection, even on matters such as the collection or the offering. If we had the time, we could pursue each of those matters. In the chapter that has been assigned to me, he discusses matters relating to marriage and single life. The first half of the chapter deals with issues involving those who are married. The last chapter addresses itself a lot more to those who are single. My task is to consider specifically the first 16 verses, where I propose to consider it under the subject counsels to unmarrieds and marriage. A counsel to unmarrieds and marriage. Let's begin with counsel to unmarrieds. I guess that if I were to ask how many were unmarried here, you would be in the majority. Let me just see your hands. I am right, aren't I? Counsel to unmarrieds. And just two things I want us to note, with some subheadings, of course. First, Paul counsels them to be like him. He wishes they were like him. Listen to his language here in chapter 7, in verse 1. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. It is good for them not to touch a woman. And in verse 8 he says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. Even as I am. Now, Paul is basically saying, one, they must remain unmarried. They must remain singles. He would prefer it that way if everyone was single like he was, if everyone was unmarried. Later in the chapter, he discusses the advantages of this. We won't go into the details of that, but it is helpful to realize that he was writing at a time when the church was in great distress. And for a man who was married and needed to look after a wife and children, it never is easy. Paul sees an advantage for those who are single, who are unmarried. They don't have to worry about issues like that. And then they have so much more time to give to the Lord's work. So he saw advantages. And he chose not to marry. It would appear that he was also gifted in that way. And he wishes everyone was like him. Another thing he is emphasizing is that they should not touch a woman. Now, there is an implication there that he's addressing men, isn't he? But I think he is also addressing women. That is quite clear in this chapter. This is just another way of saying they should not engage in premarital sex. Some sections of the modern church do not appear to be clear on such matters. Indeed, there are those who suggest that no, he is not stopping premarital sex. Yes, in those situations where people who are not necessarily married but they are not serious, yes, you could say he is saying no to that. But What about those who are engaged, who are going steady? Surely he cannot be stopping them from having sex. Oh, yes, he is. He is stopping those who are not married from having sex. Do not touch a woman. Paul seems to be suggesting here that the only sphere in which that can be the case is one in which you are married. If you are not, you should not touch a woman. Rather, according to verse 9, you should exercise self-control. That is very strongly suggested, isn't it? But I say to the unmarried and to the widow, it's good for them if they remain as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. Well, if they remain unmarried, if they remain as Paul was, they must exercise self-control. And the exercise of self-control calls us to handle ourselves, to manage ourselves, to restrain ourselves, and in this matter, he is calling them to restraining themselves from indulgence in premarital sex. That's a message we need to resound even now, even today, for those of you and most of you who are not married today. Psychologists sometimes suggest that, if you are unmarried, you are a young man, your hormones are wreaking havoc in your life, you must have some way of venting out your feelings. Otherwise, you go mad. You lose your self-esteem. You lose your ability to be courageous. You need some way of venting out this pressure. Yes, we know long ago people used to encourage that. But we are now civilized. We know better. We understand the chemistry of a human being. You need sex, whether you're married or not. No, says Paul. You need self-control. And it is possible for you to exercise self-control. When you can't control yourself, well, he has a solution to that, but we'll come to that in a moment. Singles must exercise self-control. Fourthly, they must not burn with passion. Now, that's almost an unfair statement to make. If I am a man, a single man, a young man, and I live with young women all over, all around me, some of them not so well dressed, how can I not burn with passion? Sounds unfair. But Paul seems to be suggesting that it is possible for you to exercise control over yourself and even not to burn with passion. These days, you burn so much more because you expose yourselves to things that make you to burn. On internet, on television, things you are reading, things that arouse passions that should be asleep. Expose yourself to that. You don't dress modestly and decently. How can that not arouse passion in some people? If we were able to live without exposing ourselves to that, or even becoming the occasion for arousing passion in others whom we are not married to, we would be able to keep this passion in check. Paul counsels them to be like him. There is a second thing Paul does under this counsel to unmarrieds. Paul counsels them to marry if they cannot control their passions. Listen to how he puts it here in verse 9. First, after expressing the wish that they would remain even as he was, he goes on to say in verse 9, but if they cannot exercise control, self-control, let them marry. So he is not the man who is insensitive about what others might be experiencing because he is all taken up with people being like himself, didn't seem to have a problem in that area himself. But he's sensitive. He knows there are people who may struggle. They are singles for whom this could be a big problem. And so he counsels, if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. Doesn't say, let them practice masturbation. Let them marry. Let them watch pornography so that somehow they can vent out their feelings. No. Let them marry. For, he says, he explains, it is better to marry than to burn with passion. It's better to marry than to expose yourselves with things that put pressure on your passions. Let them marry. Oh yes, some of you are asking me, what should you do about these passions? Still some time before you would marry. What should you do? Practice self-control. Keep away from things that arouse your passions. And wait for the time for you to marry. Well, that's the counsel to unmarrieds. It's quick, it's crisp. We need more time to go into details. We don't have the time. So we hurry on to counsel to the marrieds. I realize marrieds are fewer here. But Paul has many more things to say to them. And we can only touch upon that counsel. Marriage, he says two things about that. First, that it provides an opportunity for you to have a spouse, a wife, or a husband. Notice a number of things regarding that. First, when you have a spouse or a husband, he or she becomes your own. Listen to this. Your own. Verse 2, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife. And let each woman have her own husband. Paul is indirectly saying that you can't just have sex with anybody. That is sexual immorality. But you can have sex with your own wife and your own husband. Your own. He or she becomes your own. Secondly, because they have become your own, you have a duty to fulfill their conjugal rights. They were not allowed to have sex with just anybody. They could have their own. And when they have their own, they can have sex with them. Listen, verse 3. let the husband render to his wife the affection due to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. You can enjoy your own however you want, to your heart's content. Nobody will complain. Thirdly, in marriage, you have a place within which to avoid sexual immorality. I think it's John Piper who said marriage is like a dam that holds back these passions, illicit passions. Because you can enjoy your spouse and not have to worry about these illicit passions. You have a place within which to avoid sexual immorality. So Paul, in fact, is saying marriage is a good thing. There are many reasons why marriage is a good thing. One of them is that it can be a means of sanctification, a means of keeping you from immorality, sexual immorality. If you feel like you need sex, you have your spouse. And then he says this in the fourth place. You may abstain sometimes, so you can give attention to prayer and fasting, but it shouldn't be for a long time, you see, because Satan can take opportunity. Satan can tempt even those who are married. They have a place where they can enjoy that pleasure legitimately. But if they have the pleasure available to them, they are not availing themselves to it, for one reason or the other, Satan can take opportunity. And he mustn't be given the opportunity. This is how Paul puts it. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. That is the first thing he says to marriage. Provides an opportunity for them to have their own spouses and to enjoy this legitimate pleasure within the context of that marriage sphere. But the second thing he says about marriage is that it must not be ended. Must not be ended. When you marry, you must marry for life. Must not be ended. And in regard to these things, I want to highlight two things. First, in verse 10 and 11, the Lord commands a wife not to depart from her husband, and the husband not to divorce his wife. This is what he says. Now, to the married, I command, yet not I, but the Lord. What does he command? A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. A wife is not to depart from her husband. Some versions would say she is not to separate from her husband. A husband, on the other hand, is not to divorce his wife. The spirit of those statements suggests that there is a permanency that is expected of marriage. When you marry, you must plan to stick with it for life. I've married many couples over the last 34 years that I have been in the ministry. And every one of them who has stood before me to make their vows to each other have promised that they will stick to each other until death parts them. Every one of them. Can't remember one who didn't make that promise. Every one of them. And that captures the spirit of what the Lord commands here. He hates divorce. Malachi 2 verse 14. That's the command from the Lord. But the second thing I want us to note in regard to the fact that marriage must not end, it mustn't be ended, relates to Paul's own instructions. Here he says, not I, but the Lord. Well, now he says, I, not the Lord. What does he say? Well, he says, first of all, that there might be believers, Christians, who may be married to unbelievers. Maybe they married them before they became Christians. Now they are Christians. Their spouses are still not Christians. Must these believers leave their husbands or wives? Well, he speaks to this issue, verse 12. But to the rest, I, not the Lord. Now that doesn't mean what he is about to say is not inspired. Still is. In the first instance, he was quoting from the Lord himself, from the Lord's teaching. Well, now he is saying what the Lord has inspired him to say. What does he say? Christians are not to divorce their unbelieving spouses. If those spouses want to stay, I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Still underlining the fact that marriage must not end. A Christian must not end a marriage. But suppose the non-Christian in the relationship wants to end it, and they depart, they leave. Well, in those instances, a non-believer may depart. A believing spouse is not bound. In Paul's own words, in verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. But if they want to stay, they must stay. And a believer must not initiate a divorce in those circumstances. There is an advantage to the unbeliever if they stay, because the believing spouse brings certain benefits with them An unbelieving spouse will be benefited. The children will be benefited. In verse 14 he says, "For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy." To say that they are sanctified by their believing spouse doesn't mean the believing spouse makes them Christians, or merely by being married to them, they're also considered Christians. It doesn't mean that. But that they will benefit from their holy life, from what they know in terms of the Lord. They will learn from them. They will watch a good example. They will be influenced to think in a similar way, perhaps even to seek the Lord. So if you are married to an unbeliever, don't be in a hurry to leave them, because you will have a good effect on them. But if they want to leave, if they depart on their own because they are not interested in you, because now you are a Christian, you're boring, you're not cool anymore, and so they leave, well, let them leave. And he says something interesting here. Here they are. They want to leave. They want to depart. He says, let them leave. Because if you hold on to them, want to leave, they're insisting on leaving, if they hold on to them, he says in verse 15, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? They are rhetorical questions. You don't know that you will save them. You may not. But if they are bad and they want to leave, they want to depart, they are free to depart. So let me end by saying just one thing. Paul's message then in these verses appear to be that both unmarried and marriage must be content with their states. If you are unmarried, according to Paul's own desire, remain unmarried. Be like me. Be happy. And yes, take steps to check your passions. Take steps to be self-controlled. Take steps to remain pure and take advantage of your single estate. There are far too many singles who are worrying about marriage, especially young ladies. This is what they are thinking about. Who will marry me? When will I marry? Oh, I'm getting too old. Oh, all the energy goes into that. And they are not doing productive things. Take advantage of that estate. Marriage must also be content with the state of marriage and do the duties that are commensurate with that state to the glory of God. If you choose to marry, do your duty to your spouse. Be what God calls you to be. And by all means, labor to lead your marriage to the glory of God. More can be said, but in the time available to us, this is what we can say. And may the Lord bless these words to each one of our hearts. Amen.